She ran until ribbons tore from her hair, and the borrowed white dress snagged on thorn, dragging at a promise she never made. When St. Alwyn's bell fell quiet, and the guests' laughter thinned into wind, Eveline Hart knelt in the creek, letting cold water steal heat from her cheeks. She had swallowed that laugh and called it nerves, because the town had a way of making a woman apologize for the years she had survived. Her breath poured out in a fog of words she had never allowed past her teeth, a confession to the empty hills and the rough-barked trees. "I'm too old for love," she said, and the creek took the words and broke them into silver pieces and carried them away. A shadow separated from the pines upstream, broad-shouldered and still, hat-brim low, coat rough as bark. She flinched, scrambling back to her feet. A stone clenched in her wet fist. He stepped into the creek as if water were only another trail, rifle slung easy, beard sun-browned, hair tied back, a mountain man by any measure. "I've been waiting for you." "You don't know me," she managed, though the certainty in his eyes shook her worse than the hoofbeats. "Roan Mercer," he said, as if the name ought to mean nothing, and then ruined her balance with the next quiet sentence. "Eveline Hart." He had not asked, he had told her, and the way her name fit in his mouth felt like something found, not stolen. He shrugged off his coat to warm on a rock and crouched to strike flint, nursing a small flame hidden from the road. "They'll circle down from the church first," he said, "and call it rescue so it sounds less like dragging." "Why would you wait for me?" she asked. And the question tasted like a dare and a plea. He slid a cedar token from a pouch, round, thumb-worn, and for a heartbeat, she saw her initials cut faintly into the wood. Her breath hitched, but before she could speak, he closed his hand around it again, as if secrets were tinder, and this was no night for sparks. "I pass this creek every autumn," he said. "Some things tell you when to stop." The hoofbeats thickened into voices, men laughing too loudly to hide their annoyance. Barnaby's among them, sweetened with the kind of honey that sticks in the throat. "You can go back," he said, "and let them decide the rest of your years for you." "Or?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded, and how badly the word hope could hurt when it stretched. "Or you can walk with me to higher ground where no one calls you bargain or burden," he said. "No rescue, only direction without pity." He held out his hand. Not catching, not pulling, offering like a man sets bread between equals. The creek shouldered past, bright with the sentence she had thrown away. In the cottonwoods, the searchers' laughter slid closer like knives. She eyed the white dress clinging like a lie, the coat warming on the rock, and the stranger who knew her name and wore patience like armor. Wind lifted across the water and brought the tang of wood smoke and lilac from the churchyard, heavy with a Sunday that had gone wrong. She reached for his hand and stopped, because Barnaby's bay gelding broke from the trees above, men reining hard behind him, and their eyes found the creek. Behind Barnaby, townsmen fanned along the bank. Boots grinding shale, voices bright with liquor and offense, ropes uncoiling from saddle horns. Roan did not move, and the choice she had thought private became a thing the whole town would see. Barnaby Callan's laugh hit her first, loud and swollen with spite, as he rode his bay gelding down the slope, reins loose, hat tilted back like he'd just won the county fair. "There's my bride," he drawled, loud enough for every man trailing him to hear, and the word bride bent cruel in his mouth, cheap as the whiskey on his breath. The townsmen chuckled, their eyes crawling over Eveline's soaked dress, and one shouted, "She'll not run far with skirts that heavy." They hooted, proud of their own cruelty. Eveline's stomach knotted, but Roan Mercer didn't flinch. He stood in the creek, one hand easy on the rifle sling, the other resting at his side like he'd been carved into the water itself. Barnaby's grin faltered when he caught sight of him, the mountain man's shoulders squared against the falling dark. "Step aside," Barnaby barked, trying to sound like the master of cattle he fancied himself. "That's my woman, promised before God." Roan's voice cut low, steady. "She promised nothing. You mocked her years before you asked her name." Murmurs stirred in the line of men, shifting uneasily, because they remembered Barnaby's toast at the saloon, how he'd bragged of marrying a widow because she was desperate, how the laughter had rung cruel even then. Eveline's face burned with the memory, and she whispered again, "I'm too old." But Roan's eyes found hers, stopping the words before they could finish. "You're not too old to choose," he said, firm enough to carry, soft enough to belong only to her. Barnaby wheeled his horse closer, the bay's hooves splashing, and threw his arm wide toward the men. "You hear him? He steals a bride in front of half the town. Are you going to let that stand?" The men shifted, muttering. One fumbled with his rope, but another muttered, "She didn't vow yet. He's right about that." Their division hung in the smoky dusk, a tinderbox waiting for spark. Eveline's hand trembled, still half raised, and she realized with a sick twist that whichever palm she took, the slick, calloused hand of Barnaby or the broad, scarred one of Roan, would decide whether she was shamed before the whole of Dusthaven or lifted from it. Barnaby leaned down, spit flying as he snarled, "Last chance, woman. Come now or be dragged like a stray." Rowan stepped forward, the water curling around his boots, his voice as steady as the mountain behind him. "She walks where she wills, and she's not walking with you." The creek carried his words downstream, and for the first time Eveline saw Barnaby's smirk flicker into something uglier, fear. The mountain man's hand was still waiting, not demanding, not pressing, only waiting. And for the first time in years, she wanted to believe a waiting that was not empty. The men fanned wider along the bank, their boots cracking shale, their voices souring into something uglier than laughter, because Barnaby knew how to feed a crowd's weakness, and he lifted his arm like a preacher riling sinners. "Look at her!" he shouted, pointing at Eveline's soaked dress, clinging heavy to her frame, her hair falling in wet ropes about her shoulders. Running in white like a girl, when every wrinkle on her face tells you she's no maiden. Who would want her if not me? I did her a mercy, and she spat on it. The men chuckled, nervous, some egged on by drink, others by the relief of being on the stronger side, and the word mercy rolled bitter on the water, striking Eveline's ears like a lash. She shrank against the current, her hands trembling, the old shame dragging her down faster than any weight of fabric. Barnaby pressed harder, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "She knows it's true. Don't you, Eveline? Say it. You're too old for love. Tell this mountain rat he's wasting his breath and come back where you belong." She swallowed hard, her throat raw, and her lips parted to confess what years of scorn had taught her to believe. But Roan moved first, stepping so close the creek swirled around his knees, his hand outstretched once more. His voice dropped low, for her, yet carried in the stunned hush. "He calls you old because he is afraid of a woman who still stands, who has walked through years that would have broken weaker men. You think age makes you unworthy?" His eyes burned steady, steady enough to pin her soul in place. "I've been waiting for you." The words tore something inside her, words no man had ever given without mockery. And the crowd rippled uneasily, because they had heard it too, and it rang truer than Barnaby's jeers. Barnaby roared in fury, red creeping up his neck, and he drew his pistol from its holster, waving it high. "This ends now! I'll drag her, dead or alive, and you'll see who owns Dusthaven." His horse stamped and tossed its head, spooked by the sharp edge in his voice, and for the first time some of the men balked, muttering that dragging a woman in a wedding dress was no justice, only cruelty. Eveline's heart pounded like hooves on hard earth, her shame fighting against the fragile spark Roan had lit, and she stared at his open palm, the one constant in the storm. Her body shook, her voice cracked, but at last she spoke, not to Barnaby, not to the mob, but to herself and to the man who waited without demand. No more. She took his hand, and his grip closed around hers with a strength that steadied the shaking of her bones. A murmur swept through the men, disbelief and awe mixed, and Barnaby's pistol clattered as he jerked it toward them, fury boiling over. Roan's other hand slid quick as a hawk to the rifle on his back, not raised, not fired, but held with a calm that made every man watching freeze. "You'll not touch her," he said. And though the mob had jeered an hour ago, now not one voice rose to answer Barnaby's. Eveline's knees nearly buckled, not from fear, but from the sudden truth of it, that she had chosen, and the whole town had seen her do it. Barnaby's fury boiled hotter than the torches that some of the men had begun to light, his pistol swinging wildly as he wheeled his horse in the shallows, splashing water over Eveline's torn dress and over Roan's steady boots, and his voice cracked into a bellow that sought to drown out what he had just lost. "Are you all blind? She's made a fool of every one of you. This savage steals a bride before your eyes and you let him. She is mine by vow, mine by law, and if Dusthaven means to keep order, then you'll drag her back and string him up." The men shifted, muttering, their fire-fed bravado weakening under the weight of what they had witnessed. Some stared at the pistol still quivering in Barnaby's grip, others at the hand Roan had not yet loosed from Eveline's, and the truth hung heavy. She had chosen. Rowan's rifle rested across his arm, not aimed but carried with the stillness of a man who did not bluff, and his eyes scanned the faces before him, pausing on each until they dropped or turned away. "You talk of order," he said at last, his voice deep as riverstone. "But what order sells a woman as if her years were shame? What law binds a vow that was never hers to give?" The words rolled over them, cutting through the bluster, and though Barnaby snarled, the silence that followed told him the mob was slipping. He spat into the water, wheeling back to face them. "If he walks away with her, you'll all be cursed. The church mocked, our laws broken, our town shamed." He jabbed the pistol toward the blacksmith, toward the deacon's wife who had come with the others to watch, toward the younger men who shuffled with their ropes slack in hand. "You'll be remembered as cowards." But then a voice rose, shaking yet clear from behind the line, an older woman clutching a shawl tight around her shoulders. "Better coward than cruel," she said, and though her voice trembled, it pierced the fire-lit dusk like a bell. The men stilled, eyes swinging toward her, and another voice joined, firmer, the blacksmith himself, arms crossed over his chest, soot still streaking his shirt. "Barnaby, you call yourself man, but all I see is a bully with a pistol who can't stomach being refused." Murmurs rippled through the line, some men lowering their ropes, others exchanging uneasy glances, because shame spreads quicker than courage once it finds its footing. Barnaby roared, firing his pistol into the air, the blast shattering the moment, and his horse reared in terror, striking sparks off the creek rocks. "You'll all pay," he spat, his face twisted. "When the sun rises, she'll crawl back on her knees and you'll beg me to forgive you." He yanked the reins, forcing the gelding back toward town, a handful of loyal men trailing after, their curses fading into the smoke. The rest stood rooted, caught between fear and the sudden glimpse of another choice, their silence heavier than any shout. Eveline's breath came ragged, her hand still caught in Roan's, and for the first time she dared to meet the eyes of those who had jeered her that morning. None held her gaze long, and that was its own kind of victory. Roan squeezed her hand once, not in triumph, but in steadying, and murmured for her alone. A mountain breaks when it must, but it stands longer than the wind. She let the words sink, her heart pounding with the unfamiliar weight of being defended, and for the first time in years the shame that had clung to her shoulders felt as though it belonged to others, not to her. Dawn had barely begun to stain the mountains with pale light when the sound of hooves returned, heavier this time, carrying not laughter, but the iron clatter of men riding hard with purpose, and Eveline felt her stomach knot as Barnaby reappeared, flanked by a dozen more, traders, ranch hands, even the sheriff trailing along with his badge gleaming in the weak glow, his face drawn tight as if he had been cornered into this show. Barnaby swung down from his bay gelding with a flourish, a satchel clutched in his hand, and without waiting for breath he ripped it open and flung its contents into the dust at the crowd's feet. Yellowed papers, frayed at the edges, spilled like dirty secrets. Contracts stamped with county seals, receipts of debt, her late husband's scrawl inked in shaking lines. "There," Barnaby roared, his voice carrying over the murmurs that spread like wildfire. "Old Hart left her nothing but his ruin, and I bought that ruin fair. Every acre, every stick of timber, every nail in that cabin, and every promise attached to it. She's not free, she's payment, and I'll have what's mine." Eveline staggered, the sight of her husband's handwriting striking harder than any blow, because she remembered those nights when he coughed blood into rags, his hand trembling as he signed papers he never explained, and she had been too tired, too frightened to ask. Murmurs swelled. Townsfolk leaned in, squinting at the papers, whispering of debts, of law, of obligations that could not be shrugged aside. Barnaby's grin split wide, sensing the turn. "You call me cruel? I am lawful. You call him thief?" He jabbed a finger at Roan, who stood silent at her side, the rifle still slung calm across his shoulder. "He is the thief, stealing what was sold long ago. You would honor savages over your own courts?" The sheriff stepped forward, his voice brittle. The contracts appeared genuine, and the words were almost enough to break her knees because they carried weight heavier than stone, and she felt every gaze tilting back toward Barnaby, every whisper turning sharp. But Roan bent, lifting one of the pages between his fingers, holding it up to the rising sun, and his voice cut through the mutters with steady iron. "You think these marks bind her? They bind only the hand that made them. A dying man cannot sell the soul of the living." He let the paper fall, crumbling into dust beneath his boot. Barnaby sneered, triumphant still. "You deny the law. You spit on order." Roan's eyes never left his, and his voice rang clear. "I stand on a law older than your courts. She is not debt. She is not coin. She is not yours." Gasps stirred, some angry, some shaken, and Eveline felt heat rise in her chest, not from shame this time, but from the slow spark of rage that she had been traded without her knowing. She found her voice, thin but trembling with force, and spoke where all could hear. "My husband may have left debts. I will not live as one." The words cracked across the square like a whip, and for the first time the men faltered, uncertain, because Barnaby's proof had turned into something sourer, a claim that stank of ownership over flesh and soul. Barnaby's face twisted, rage boiling, and he shouted, "Then by sundown, I'll take what's owed by fire or by rope." He kicked the papers into the air, their ash-colored edges scattering like carrion feathers, and mounted with a snarl, riding off with his men trailing, leaving behind the stench of smoke and fear, and a town split more sharply than ever. Eveline swayed, her hand still caught in Roan's, and though fear gnawed her ribs raw, his grip anchored her like granite. For the first time she saw Barnaby's threats for what they were. Not law, not justice, only the tantrum of a man terrified of being refused. And in that moment, The doubt that had haunted her, "I'm too old for love," felt smaller than the fire stirring now in her chest. By the time the sun rode high over Dusthaven, Barnaby's threats had spread faster than wildfire, whispered from the blacksmith's forge to the church pews, until every man, woman, and child had heard the words. By sundown, he would claim Eveline by rope or burn the town itself to cinders. His horse clattered down the main street at noon, his voice booming with a rehearsed authority, flanked now not only by his ranch hands, but by drifters eager for coin and drink, men whose rifles and dead eyes gave weight to his promise. He reined up before the saloon, pistol lifted high, and declared that law was on his side, waving copies of the debt papers as if they were scripture, his grin twisting as he shouted, "If the town denies me, the town itself denies law, and law denied burns quick." The sheriff lingered on the boardwalk, badge dulled by shame, but his silence was answer enough, and many in the crowd muttered, some frightened into nods, others whispering dissent. Eveline stood with Roan just beyond the square, her hand in his though her pulse thundered, watching how the town seemed to lean toward Barnaby's fury, and her heart clenched with dread. "They'll follow him," she whispered, trembling. "They're tired of being afraid, but too weak to turn." Roan's gaze swept the crowd, calm as stone even in the face of the mob. "Fear makes men loud," he said softly, "but shame makes them quiet, and they are quieter than they want to be." Yet the tension thickened with every word Barnaby spat, his followers jeering, calling Roan a thief and Eveline a burden no man should want. Eveline's chest burned, for the old lies clawed at her again. Too old, too used, too late. But when she glanced at Roan, he was steady, watching her, his presence a wall between her and the venom. Then Barnaby's voice cracked into the threat that silenced even his allies. "At sundown, if she is not delivered, I'll light every roof in Dusthaven and salt the ashes so nothing grows again." Gasps and curses rippled, mothers dragging children close, men gripping their rifles, the choice laid bare before them. Submit or burn. Eveline's knees nearly buckled, but Roan shifted, pulling her forward, so all eyes swung to see them emerge into the square. He raised the rifle from his shoulder, not at the mob, but into the air, and fired once, the crack echoing against the mountains. Silence fell like a hammer, and his voice, low but carrying, cut through the smoke and fear. "You call her debt. I call her vow. You call her burden. I call her mine." He laid his hand openly on Eveline's shoulder, firm, unashamed, and for the first time the town saw her not as Barnaby's leftover or Hart's widow, but as a woman standing at the side of a man who had chosen her without shame. Whispers swirled, unsettled, and Barnaby's face darkened, his pistol shaking with rage as he barked, "Then both of you burn!" He wheeled his horse, rallying his men, and the crowd broke apart in panic, scattering to doorways, leaving Dusthaven caught in the balance of flame and defiance. Eveline's breath tore ragged in her chest, but when Roan looked down at her, steady as the mountains, she knew the truth had shifted. For the first time she was not too old for love. She was too strong to be traded. Sundown had not yet come when Barnaby decided patience was for cowards. He lit his promise early, striding from the saloon with a torch stolen from the hearth, his face alight with rage and drink, his men jeering behind him as though the town itself were a stage for his fury. With a whoop, he hurled the fire against the porch of the general store, and dry timber caught quick, smoke curling upward in black ribbons that painted the sky. Cries erupted as townsfolk rushed with buckets, women dragging children from the square, but Barnaby only laughed, pistol raised high, shouting, "This is what defiance buys. By dawn she'll kneel or Dusthaven will be ash." The flames licked higher, windows shattering, and the heat drove the crowd back. But through the smoke, Eveline stood rigid, her body trembling not with fear alone, but with the terrible clarity that this man would destroy everything simply to own her name. Rowan stepped forward, his rifle at his side, his voice carrying over the roar of fire. "You burn your own town for pride. No vow, no love, only hunger." His calm drew stares, and even through panic some paused, their buckets dangling, their shame made plain. Barnaby snarled, wheeling to fire into the air again, the crack scattering pigeons and echoing off the hills. But the crowd no longer cheered. Their eyes shifted, uneasy, between the flames and the mountain man who stood unmoved. Eveline's chest clenched, her shame tugging at her like chains, whispering she was the cause, the reason homes would burn. But when she met Rowan's gaze, she saw only steadiness, as if he bore the weight with her, not against her. He stepped closer, laying his hand firm against hers before the town. "If fire is his law, then we stand in the open," he said, and though his words were simple, they struck like stone in the dust. The blacksmith, soot streaking his face, staggered forward from the bucket line, hammer in hand, and planted himself beside them, his voice hoarse but clear. "No more. This town burns for him, not for her." Gasps rippled, a shift like wind through tall grass, and others hesitated, torn between siding with Barnaby's fire or standing in the shadow of something steadier. Barnaby, furious at the crack forming in his control, hurled another torch, this time at the livery, and horses screamed as flames caught hay. Eveline cried out, instinct pulling her forward, but Rowan's grip held firm, steadying her against the surge of terror. "This is his weakness," he murmured. "Fire cannot bind love." The boy from the schoolhouse dashed into the line, shouting, "He'll burn us all! Stand with them!" And though his voice cracked, the sound of a child pleading tipped hearts heavier than law. Barnaby roared in denial, but the crowd no longer roared with him. Their shouts tangled, fractured, until silence pressed in thicker than smoke. Eveline's hand tightened in Rowan's, her heart pounding as the fire painted the night, and for the first time she believed the words she had not dared. She was not too old for love, only too late to keep hiding from it. The fire from the livery roared against the night sky, spitting sparks that clung to rooftops, and Dusthaven itself seemed to glow like a forge ready to shatter, its people pulled taut between two masters, fear and shame. Barnaby sat tall on his gelding, pistol gleaming, torch smoke swirling around his sneer as he barked at the townsfolk to douse their doubts and obey. "He'll drag you all down," he snarled, pointing at Rowan, "that mountain savage and the woman too proud to know her place. If you don't hand her over, every roof you've built, every bed your children sleep in, will be ash by dawn. You want to save yourselves? Then stand with me." Some men grunted assent, lifting rifles with hands that trembled, but more kept their eyes down, staring at the flames as if they saw their own sins flickering back at them. Eveline's breath caught in her chest, certain she was the curse Barnaby painted her to be, but Rowan's voice carried low and steady, stronger than the crackle of fire. "A man who burns his own home owns nothing. A woman is no debt. A vow is no chain. Choose now, Dusthaven. Choose who you are." The words settled over the square like a slow storm, heavier than smoke, pressing into ears that had long closed themselves to conscience. The blacksmith stepped forward again, hammer in his grip, his jaw tight, and planted himself square beside Eveline and Rowan. "If you'll burn us," he growled toward Barnaby, "then burn me first. But I won't call your cruelty law." His daughter clutched his arm, nodding with tear-bright eyes, and a murmur rose among the crowd, uncertain but growing. The deacon's wife, pale and trembling, lifted her Bible high. "Better we lose our homes than our souls," she cried, and the hush that followed cracked something deep. A handful of men lowered their rifles. A few tossed their torches into the mud, sparks hissing as they died. Barnaby roared in fury, spurring his horse, wheeling in a circle as if his rage alone could bind them again. "You think bread and whispers can save you?" he bellowed. "You'll follow me or you'll burn with them." But even his loyalists looked shaken now, their eyes sliding from his pistol to the mountain man who hadn't raised his rifle once, who stood unflinching with Eveline's hand caught firmly in his. Eveline felt the crowd shifting, fragile as spun glass, and though her legs shook, she found her voice rising clearer than she thought possible. "I am not Det," she said, her voice breaking but loud enough to carry. "I am not too old. I am not his." Her words struck the crowd sharper than gunfire, because they came from a woman who had been mocked for years, who stood now with dignity laid bare in firelight. A hush followed, broken only by the crackle of burning beams. Barnaby's face twisted crimson, and he aimed his pistol straight at her heart, desperate to rip back what he had lost. But before the shot rang, a boy's voice cracked high from the back. "She chose him! We all saw it!" And suddenly the silence turned to cries of defiance, neighbors stepping forward, families pressing toward Eveline and Roan, the line splitting plain before all. Dusthaven had been 2 towns in whispers. Now it was 2 towns in the open, and the night itself seemed to wait, trembling for which half would hold. Barnaby saw the line turn against him, and panic crawled up his spine until it came out as madness, his voice breaking as he shrieked that Dusthaven was his, that the town owed him obedience, that Eveline owed him her years like coin in a purse. He yanked the reins hard, and the bay reared, hooves striking sparks, and before anyone could blink, his pistol cracked and fire spat across the square. The blacksmith, standing firm at Roan's side, jerked as the bullet tore his shoulder, stumbling but refusing to fall, his hammer dropping with a clang that echoed louder than the shot. Screams erupted, women dragging children behind wagons, men shouting curses, some scattering, some surging forward, the fragile balance breaking in an instant. Eveline cried out, moving toward the blacksmith, but Roan's arm swept her behind him, his rifle unslung in one motion, the barrel gleaming as he leveled it steady on Barnaby. The outlaw laughed, high and cracked, the sound of a man losing grip, and shouted, "See? He'll kill me, and then he'll kill you all. You'll wish you had given her to me when I asked." But no echo rose this time, no cheer from his loyalists, only mutters, only shame heavy in their throats. Roan did not fire. He stepped forward into the open, his voice carrying over the chaos. "You call this law? To shoot a man who stood unarmed? To drag a woman as debt? Dusthaven, is this the law you kneel to?" The townsfolk stilled, torn, as the blacksmith's daughter pressed a rag to her father's bleeding shoulder, her tear-streaked face lifted toward the crowd. "No," she cried, "not anymore." The sound cracked like a whip, and several rifles dipped. Some men even turning away from Barnaby, their courage buckling. Rage twisted his face. He swung the pistol toward Eveline, eyes burning with the promise to finish what he started, but Roan's shot split the air first, the bullet striking the dust a hair's breadth from Barnaby's boot, a warning sharp as thunder. The horse screamed, rearing high, nearly throwing its rider, and Barnaby clung wild, cursing as the crowd gasped. Eveline, her hands shaking, felt her own voice rise unbidden, cutting through the panic. "You call me old as insult. I call myself alive, and I will not crawl for you." The words struck harder than Rowan's bullet, for the crowd, neighbors who had mocked her, gossiped, pitied, saw her standing in the firelight, dress torn, hair unbound, yet unbroken, and the shame that had been hers for years turned suddenly into theirs. The sheriff staggered forward at last, pistol drawn but his eyes hollow, torn between the law he was sworn to and the truth burning before him. "Barnaby," he said, his voice quaking. "It ends tonight." But Barnaby screamed denial, lifting his gun to fire at Eveline, and the mob, broken by the sight, erupted. Men rushing, women crying, apprentices hurling stones, the tide of Dusthaven finally breaking loose. Roan surged forward, seizing Barnaby's wrist before the trigger could fall, the two men crashing into the dust, one clawing like a mad dog, the other steady as the mountain. The crowd swarmed closer, the fire's glow spilling across faces no longer willing to hide, and Eveline felt the whole town's soul hang on that struggle, on whether Dusthaven would belong to cruelty or to love. The square thundered with boots and shouts as Roan and Barnaby rolled in the dust, the outlaw clawing and spitting like a cornered animal, the mountain man's strength forged in silence and solitude, now bent to one purpose: to end the tyranny of a man who thought law meant ownership. Barnaby's pistol fired once into the dirt, sparks flying, but Roan's knee came down hard on his chest, pinning him, his rifle tossed aside so that only raw will held him down. The crowd pressed in a circle, their torches throwing firelight across faces streaked with ash and fear, the blacksmith bleeding but alive, his daughter clutching his arm, the deacon's wife still holding her Bible high, as though the verses themselves had stepped into flesh. Eveline stood trembling, her breath harsh, her torn dress plastered to her skin. Yet her voice rose clear when Barnaby shrieked, "She's mine! She owes me! You all saw the papers!" And she answered, "I owe you nothing. I am no man's debt, no man's bargain. I am woman enough to be chosen." Her words cracked the air louder than any bullet, and the mob, so long fed on cruelty, found themselves shamed into silence, their eyes falling, their rifles lowering. Roan bent close to Barnaby, his hand pressing the outlaw's wrist into the dirt until the pistol dropped from his fingers. "She chose, and Dusthaven watched," Roan said, his voice low but carrying like a drumbeat through the hush. "Your fire ends tonight." The sheriff at last stirred from his paralysis, pushed forward with irons, his face pale but his hand steady as he clamped the cuffs over Barnaby's wrists. The outlaw writhed, cursing, spitting that he would rise again, but no man moved to free him. Not one ally remained. Even the drifters slunk back into the shadows, unwilling to chain themselves to his ruin. Dusthaven had turned. Roan rose, drawing Eveline to her feet, and for the first time she did not look down or away, but straight into the eyes of those who had mocked her as too old, too spent, too late. "You will not call me less again," she said, her chin lifted, her hand still wrapped in the mountain man's. The crowd bowed their heads, not in reverence, but in shame, for they knew she was right. The fire at the livery was quenched at last by dozens of hands, not for Barnaby, but for themselves, for the children who deserved a town better than the one they had almost allowed to burn. And as dawn crept over the peaks, Eveline stood in the ashes of her fear. Roan's arm around her shoulders, the mountain wind cold yet clean. "I thought I was too old for love," she whispered, and he turned, his eyes dark but soft, his answer the same steady vow as before. "I've been waiting for you." Her heart trembled, not with doubt now, but with the fierce, fragile knowledge that she was wanted, not as pity, not as debt, but as herself. The town dispersed in silence, carrying its scar into mourning, but Eveline carried something else, a hand that did not let go, a vow spoken before fire and fear and the quiet strength of a man who had waited long enough. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. When she cried that she was too old for love, he answered with waiting. If you had been in Dusthaven that night, would you have stood with them too?